Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland, and behind me you can see probably the most famous bench on a traffic island in the world. That is the bottom bench. So if you ever watched the early 90s British sitcom Bottom, the opening credits featured Rick Mayall and Adrian Edmondson sitting on that bench, and the traffic going by, and this shopping centre, Hammersmith shopping centre, behind them. Anyway, so it was a really groundbreaking, gritty, somewhat sardonic comedy, and there in the early 90s when the recession was still on. And if you read the inscription more closely, and I can't recall it word for word, it's to the memory of Dr. the Rick Mayall, saying how he was a worldwide phenomenon and things like that. And it's got a few buzzwords which really encapsulated his attitude to life. And then Barbara, love is the answer, as in honour of his wife. You should see some footage from several years ago when he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Exeter. And Baroness Floella Benjamin gave that to him. She's the Chancellor of the university. And he gave those graduating that day pieces of his mind, and one of them is that love is the answer, and so on, claiming to have failed his O-levels and things like that, and failed his A-levels, and getting into Manchester University on an interview and not even showed up to his finals. That's actually not true. He's one of the few people to, in fact, underrate his own academic achievement, just because it made it all the more mirthful that he was then awarded an honorary doctorate of letters. So, who was Rick Mayall? If I got this right, he was born in 1957 in the English Midlands. So both his parents were drama teachers, and he acted from an early age. He was not that academic and not particularly into sport, so he went up to the University of Manchester in 1975. And in those days, very few people went to university, under 10% of the population. But so there were no fees at all, and there were grants for everyone to live off, all the undergraduates, no matter how wealthy your parents. That was a grant, not a loan. And there he met Adrian Edmondson, who was to be his comedic soulmate. He also met Ben Elton, and perhaps a few other waifs and strays. Anyway, he graduated, and he came down to London, which was, of course, the heart of the comedy scene. And alternative comedy was starting to get going. And he soon met Alexis Sale, this Scouse Marxist, who really gelled with them. They riffed off each other. And it was just when the Comedy Store opened. The original Comedy Store, of course, is in New York, and then the London Comedy Store opened shortly thereafter. They soon met two young drama teachers named Dawn French and Jennifer Saunders. Well, actually, Jennifer Saunders had completed the course, but wasn't actually teaching drama. Anyhow, and they all got together. And in fact, Adrian Edmondson, who seemed to be Rick Mayall's dearest friend, he married Jennifer Saunders. So, more about this. Anyway, he really had this explosive comedic talent for taking off all sorts of notorious university stereotypes. And one of them was someone from a pucker background who affected proletarian manners and far-left views. And you can see an embryonic Rick, the young one's character, whom Rick Mayall performed, I think, when he was still at the University of Manchester. That's on YouTube, not a very well-known video, and it's actually part of the closing sequence of a documentary about the late Rick Mayall. Anyway, so the young ones when they really burst onto the scene. This has been the early 80s, the days when there were only 3 television channels, and so if you're on telly even once, you were famous for life. And so that was obviously a fantastic achievement of them being at age about 23, writing their own show and getting it broadcast by the BBC. And its opening credits has that Cliff Richard song, The Young Ones. And of course, Cliff Richard's lifestyle and theirs could not be more different. As in, Cliff Richard, who's an ardent Christian and very clean living and really just notoriously dull. And these reprobates living in a house, attending the fictitious scumbag college in an undisclosed location. And Adrian Edmondson plays this psychopath with bolts through his head, gelled hair, dyed orange, almost like a punk, always wearing a leather jacket and denims, and smashing through walls. And what is he studying? Of course, medicine. And then Rick Mayall plays Rick, this undergraduate from an upper middle class background, who's trying to be fashionably left wing, this trendy lefty's got so many badges on his lapel, you can tell his view on any issue without ever speaking to him. And there are a few more. In Alexei Sale, he plays numerous roles like the landlord and all sorts of other things. I can't remember the other characters. Well, there's Nigel Planer, the hippie with hair down to his waist, who's always talking about vegetable rights and peace, and everything being very heavy and always threatening to commit suicide. And the others express total indifference to that, never quite carries it through. But anyway, I think I better fast forward onto bottom, as we are at the bottom bench. So there they were in their 30s, and they decided this character, Bottom, at the time of high unemployment, these two jobless, sexually perverted, alcoholic desperados inhabit some dank flat here in Hammersmith, which was not as she back then as it is today. And they're hatching their madcap plans to get sex and fame. They obviously never come to fruition, often going to certain pubs and things like that. The infamous Chris Langham actually had a bit part in one of their shows. So Bottom, why did they come up with the name? Well, they thought they'd call it Your Bottom, because then it would give everyone the glee of saying, I saw your bottom last night, as in that would be the title of the show. But then they called it Bottom because they're at the bottom of the pile, and their numerous characters have got walk-on parts, people who are also in the Young Ones. So obviously made in a shoestring budget, but performed in front of a live studio audience. And they're always trying to impress women and wave at the Queen and be awarded knighthoods and go on an expedition to show their daring do. They gallantly go all the way to Wimbledon Common, which is about 3 miles over the bridge. And some pervert comes and flashes them in their tent at night, so they burn his testimonials with their cooking gas thing. But they had to change that one because just before it's due to be broadcast, this young woman called Rachel Nickel was murdered whilst in the presence of a 2-year-old child. So that just seemed too dark. So it was a moratorium. It was broadcast about a year after it was originally scheduled to be shown. And on and on. So it really was hilarious. And there's some of the Dangerous Brothers antics got into that one. They played two completely mental, violent characters called the Dangerous Brothers before that, always going in for slapstick comedy and verbally sparring off each other. So Adrian Edmondson, one of his fantastic characters was, of course, Alan Bastard. Alan Bastard, who was a low-down, snivelling, cowardly, lying, grasping, backstabbing, egomaniacal MP, a Tory, and that was that. So it was Bastard by name and Bastard by nature. And it was right at the end of the Thatcher era, and even a character who represents Thatcher appears in it briefly. And then around about 2003, Alan Bastard came back, and of course by this stage, if we're talking about lying, warmongering, racism, complete indifference to the poor, rampant corruption, all this, yes, by that stage Labour really had stolen all the Tories' best ideas. So Alan Bastard had crossed the floor to the Labour Party, and famously when there was a photo call for Rick Mayall, who's playing Alan Bastard, he says to the press, fuck off, we don't like poor people, this is the Labour Party here, which was just how low Labour had sunk around that time. Weapons grade Y fronts, a very topical comedic theme in 2003 when the liberation of Iraq kicked off, and on and on. And then about 10 years ago, going on a UK-wide tour, redoing Bottom as a live show. So he was a man of the most incomparable talent, just extraordinarily creative. He lived in Barnes, which is just south of the river here, and he went jogging. It's about 2013, came home, complained of being unwell, and unfortunately dropped dead. He was only about 57. So he's married, he had 3 daughters. Well, I don't think he ever did a feeble show. I don't think he ever told a gag that bombed. He was just really exceptionally gifted and so productive. They don't make him like that anymore. And so obviously all his showbiz friends were there at his funeral. And obviously I didn't realise that show business is a notoriously catty world. And again, I don't know of anybody who had a bad word to say about him. I suppose it's to my lasting regret that I never saw Rick Mayall live. So I must try and see Adrian Edmondson, his comedy partner, live, and a few of the others. You can see the Young Ones was hysterical. They spared no one. There were no sacred cows for them. Taking the mick out of University Challenge and things like that. And that was the early 80s, the height of its popularity, with Bamber Gascoigne was being the one asking the questions. So that's Rick Mayall, the only Rick who spelt his name R-I-K, but unfortunately R-I-K is now R-I-P.